Let's start with the first conversation of the day, and that has to do with thumb rules that help you plan your finances better. Not all thumb rules are set to work perfectly. As they say, when it comes to personal finance, the definition has personal in it because your context is different from everybody else's. So we're going to discuss some of these rules and we're going to tell you how they can apply to you. Let me introduce my guest for the day. We've got Hemant Rustagi of Wiseinvest Advisors. Thank you so much, Hemant, for taking the time. As always, appreciate it. Let's start with a few of these, and I've selected 7 to talk to you about. Let's start with the first one, which is a pretty common one. It's the rule of 72. It helps you understand how much time it would take for you to double your money. How do you use this when it comes to personal finance?
Alex, I think this is an important rule, the rule of 72. Basically, what it tells you is that in how many years can you double your money? So, for example, if you're investing in an instrument which is giving you 6% return, fixed return, you divide 72 by 6, it'll take you around 12 years. So if you're investing in a product which is a market-linked product, and you assume the return to be, let's say, 10%, which means that your money will double in 7.2 years, quadruple in maybe 14 and a half years. So I think this gives you an idea, but how it is beneficial is one, it tells you about power of compounding, how power of compounding works and how this brings magic to your investment process. That's very, very important for every investor to understand. Second is when you're investing for a long-term goal and you have a certain target to be achieved after a certain number of years, and you have a target in mind. Now the rule of 72 broadly tells you that at what rate you need to earn your return to get there. Now, once you are able to figure out that, okay, this is the kind of return I need to make to double my money after a certain number of years, this helps you in deciding your asset allocation and also within that, which option will work for you. So I think these are 2 major advantages, but I think as an investor, there are a couple of things that you need to remember. One is that the return that you consider should be a post-tax return, not the gross return, because especially when you're investing in traditional options, and where the income is taxable, most of them, post-tax return is much, much lower. So that's something that you, as an investor, already need to remember. And second thing is, the return, especially when you're investing in a market-linked product, is just an estimate, which means that you need to monitor your portfolio over your defined time horizon to ensure that it remains on track to achieve whatever is return you have estimated. So I think these are 2 important things that investors need to remember if you are following the rule of 72.
And you said it, Hemant, you've actually hit the nail on the head. But then this is useful when you're planning, especially long-term goals, right? Because you would be able to then gauge specifically how much you would need to set aside to these goals in, say, an SIP, assuming, for example, in an equity scheme, you would get a CAGR of 12%. That would help you plan your goals better, right? But let's talk about the next one. And I think this is something that will appeal to a lot of young viewers. A lot of them talking about financial freedom. But the question is, how much do you really need for that goal, and how soon can you start it? Is 4%, is the 4% rule really something that works?
Well, this is called the 4% freedom rule. So clearly, I tell you what happens, Alex, here is that this gives you an idea. It's a simple rule. Basically, what it tells you that if you were to draw 4% of your corpus, right, for how many years roughly it will last. So for example, if you're someone who's looking for retirement and the annual expense is around 5 lakh rupees. So you're looking at 4% withdrawal, which means that you need to multiply your requirement by 25. So which means that you need a corpus of 1.25 crore to be able to draw 4%, and which is good enough to take care of your expenses. So depending on basically what your expenses are likely to be, it gives you an idea. But the problem is you begin with drawing 4%, then every year you need to consider inflation, right? Which means that the next year is going to be higher and the next year is even higher. So the point is that even though this rule propagates that asset allocation of 50% in equity and 50% in debt, which means that, if you take conservative estimate of 10% and 5%, you get around 7.5%, right? So again, considering that inflation is very high in our country, it is not going to last 30 years that it envisaged. So clearly, it's important to understand that this is just a thumb rule. You need to be very careful. You need to look at your own personal situation, which means that if you want to take out more, you need to take more risk, or you also have to give yourself more time to accumulate the kind of corpus you would require. So anyone who's looking to retire early must always remember this, that this is a conservative estimate, and this only gives you an idea of how much should you withdraw for your portfolio to last 30 years. But then it depends on how much you're able to earn. The second issue with this is that this does not take into consideration your non-portfolio income. So someone who's retiring at a traditional age, and if there is a pension coming in, it does not take that into account. But this is something that everyone should remember. The third thing is that there are some retirees who are able to invest more aggressively than others, which means that the return is likely to be higher than what this rule basically envisages. So clearly, there are 2-3 things that everyone who wants to follow this 4% rule need to remember.
And just to add to that, Hemant, there's also the aspect of retiring early or financial freedom doesn't necessarily mean that you need to stop earning completely. You can pick up activities that don't necessarily give you as much remuneration as the others, right? So that's something to bear in mind. The third one I wanted to discuss with you is the allocation rule, right? How much do you allocate towards a particular asset class? And it says 100 minus your age. Is this too simplistic according to you?
Well, look, this is a thumb rule which says that 100 minus your age should be invested in equity. Now, for example, if someone who's 25-year-old, according to this thumb rule, 75% should be in equity and the rest should be in debt. And someone who is 60-year-old, 40% should be in equity and 60% should be in debt. Now, the thing is, this is a thumb rule. And as you rightly mentioned at the beginning, I mean, not all the thumb rules will apply to you or will be beneficial to you. The problem with this rule is that it makes asset allocation very simple. But in reality, it is not. Because one thing it does not consider is your personal situation. For example, even if someone who is 25-year-old, and as per this rule, the person should be investing around 75% in equity, but if he has some financial liabilities or some responsibilities in the family, the person may not be able to invest 75% in equity. Similarly, someone who is a retiree may have personal situation different from and other people who have retired. Maybe all the responsibilities have been taken care of. There are no financial burden on them. Maybe they can invest more because, especially when you're trying to build a corpus for posterity and give it to your children, you can invest, aggressively. So one, it does not take into account your personal situation. The second problem with this rule is that it basically propagates a concept of pooling or your investment, because when you're looking at asset allocation based on your age, which means that 75% in equity, it does not consider your risk profile. It does not consider your short-term and medium-term, long-term goals. There may be goals where a significant part has to be invested for short-term. It does not consider that. And the problem is that when you pool all your investment, one, either you make your portfolio very, very aggressive, depending on what age you're trying to build that portfolio. So I think it's very, very important to remember that while this makes asset allocation very simple, the best thing is to follow a goal-based investment process, wherein you define your short-term, medium-term, long-term goals. Each goal set a target, and then based on an assumed rate of return, work out your asset allocation, and you try to make an investment plan to achieve that. But this is a rule I generally would not recommend that investors should follow.
But let's now speak about the emergency rule, which says that you need to have a certain amount of money set aside for emergencies. Hemant, it says this is the 3x emergency rule. What, according to you, is the right level that one must keep in the contingency fund?
Well, this rule says basically that your emergency corpus should be equivalent to your 3 months commitments or expenses. But over a period of time, obviously, what investors have realized and what has been propagated is that it should be at least 6 months. But what we saw in the last couple of years during this pandemic is that the 6 months, emergency corpus was not enough. So basically, what I feel is that there can be situations where the emergency corpus equivalent to a 6-month monthly commitment may not be large enough. So you should try and provide for additional 3 to 6 months So at least make it 9 months to make sure that if you are faced with any financial exigency, that you have enough resources to make sure that you're not disturbing your investment process, and you're able to handle those financial stresses in a much better manner. But I think there are a couple of things I would say that every investor need to remember when you're trying to build up an emergency corpus. One is that don't take only your household expenses. When we talk about your needs, so basically it should be your insurance premium, it should be your rent, it should be your EMIs and your household expenses. Consider that and then multiply that by 6 or 9 months, and then you'll arrive at a number which should be your emergency corpus. And the second thing is very important, that it should be investing in a manner that it is available to you at any point in time. The market volatility should not be impacting it. That's why either you should be looking at, if you're looking at mutual fund as an option, you should look at maybe liquid funds, or you can even keep it in your short-term bank deposit. So have adequate emergency fund, and also ensure that it's liquid and it's available to you whenever you're faced with any financial exigency.
Absolutely. And in fact, I've heard financial experts like yourself suggest a higher contingency fund in the event that you are the single earner in a family. It's always a good idea to keep more in that situation. But let's talk about the management of inflow of cash, right? Because this is something that a lot of people struggle with, especially young people nowadays, because there's so much to spend on, right, Hemant? So there's a 50-30-20 rule. How would you say that one can use that here? Is it something that is still valid considering the kind of spending patterns that you're witnessing today?
Well, let's understand what this rule says. This rule says that 50% should be kept aside for your needs, which I just mentioned, that it would be hard household expenses, your insurance premium, EMIs, rent. 30% is basically for your needs, which would be entertainment and traveling, and 20% is for saving. Now, what this rule does is basically it propagates one thing, is that you need to provide for your needs, wants, and savings in a manner that you do not end up compromising your financial future. But of course, it's a thumb rule again. It only propagates that you need to provide for each one of them separately. A lot will depend on what your personal situation is. For example, what we saw during the lockdown period and period thereafter is that the money that was usually being spent on needs, which is entertainment and traveling, did not happen. So obviously there was an opportunity for investors to kind of allocate more, provided you were not impacted, your income was not impacted, to savings. So like I said, it's relevant to the extent that it tells you that you need to provide for these things separately in a reasonable manner. And second, I think it also propagates one thing, is that it prompts you or encourages you to save money on a regular basis. To that extent, I think this rule is very useful. But the extent of how much you provide, broad parameters, I think this is how it should be. But I think there is always a scope for you to maybe kind of spend less on needs and maybe invest slightly more for saving. So that's one thing. It depends on your personal situation. You can make a change.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better. The next one relates to the amount that you should spend towards an EMI. And it says 40%. And this is something that I think a lot of home buyers struggle with, right? Because especially if you're talking about buying a home here in Mumbai, Hemant, it's practically impossible to do that if you're talking about certain pockets without taking a massive loan. So is 40% EMI still relevant today? Should you struggle and make sure that that is something that you follow?
Well, look, we just talked about 50-30-20, which very clearly said that 50% is including EMI. And there are other commitments that you had. So if you go beyond 40%, what it means that you'll end up compromising on other needs. And also you'll end up compromising on your wants as well as savings, which means that you'll be putting your financial future to risk. So it's very, very important to make sure that it remains within 40% of your take-home salary or the net post-tax salary. That should be the outer limit. Try and minimize that to the extent it is possible, but definitely should not go beyond 40%. Otherwise, like I mentioned, if you look at this, okay, in conjunction with the rule that we talked about earlier, clearly you'll end up making a big compromising, and which is something that should be avoided.
Okay, and the last one has to do with the life insurance rule. How does one understand this?
Well, I think the thumb rule says that the sum assured for your life insurance should be 20 times of your annual income. That's a thumb rule again. Normally, the factors that you consider is your age, your income, and your outstanding loans. But if you find this a little cumbersome, then you can follow the thumb rule, which clearly says that it should be at least 20 times of your annual income. But it's equally important to make sure that you buy the right product. That's why it's always recommended that you should buy a term plan, because one, it gives you the kind of risk cover you need. The second is premium is much lower than the other traditional option. The second thing you need to remember is, while this may be the starting point, you need to review your insurance needs over a period of time. For example, if your income level goes up in the next 5 years, so clearly you need to kind of relook at how much cover you would need in line with that. So don't just look at one figure at the beginning and continue that for the 15, 20 years. Keep relooking at it. And if you need to enhance the cover, by all means, you must do that. But like I said, this is just a thumb rule, maybe good enough for people who find it little cumbersome to ascertain how much sum assured they require.
Absolutely, Hemant. I think that is the purpose of most of these thumb rules, right? To get you started. And of course, with shows like this one, we'll help our viewers get a lot more well-versed with how to manage their money. Always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time.